over 2 decades ago. So it's not an easy thing to think about, and it's not an easy way to try to put yourself in that world. So, I mean, we can't understand whatsoever what Caril was thinking at that point. But, you know, one of the things that I do find fascinating is the note that she left on her door, and you kind of alluded to it with putting her hand over her mouth and just giving clues as to what was going on. Maybe people were dense and weren't catching on to it, which is, that probably happens way too much in the real world or in the modern world, let's be honest. But the flu note, talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, when people showed up at the door starting to go, you know, well, what's going on, they found a note on the door that said, everyone is sick with the flu, go away, everyone's sick with the flu, Miss Bartlett, and Miss Bartlett was underlined 3 times. And the reason why that's significant is because she went by Fugate because that was her mother's, she was the child of her mother's first marriage. Her mother went by Mrs. Bartlett because that was the, you know, name of her current husband. So the only Miss Bartlett in the house was the 2-year-old little baby. And so, you know, the other family members got it. Both her family, this is one of the things that's crazy too, is even a lot of people who know the case don't actually know that Charlie's family went there too. His brother and his sister both showed up at the house at different times, saw the note, you know, that's what was going on, saw Caril. Caril was saying about the, you know, everyone's sick, go away, was, you know, looking at them through a window saying that. And, but in every case, in every case, they were like, they got that was a clue, that Caril had left that as a note, as a clue for something to happen, that something was going on. And so they all went from her, you know, it's her grandmother, his brother, his sister, her stepbrother, brother-in-law, Caril's brother-in-law. They all saw the note and they all went to the police saying, hey, something's going on over there, go check it out. And the police just blew them off, kept saying, no, you're crazy, nothing's going on, all that sort of thing. Finally, the grandmother got one of the police to just go over there and check it out. She answered the door. It was all done exactly. You know, everything kind of happened exactly as people had said. And the police officer wouldn't put. You know, grandmother was like, "You need to go in there. You need to push your way in." And he was like, "No, stop bothering them." And as he drove her back home, that police officer literally just called the old woman crazy. Said, "You're crazy. Stop interfering with your family's life." When the brother and Charlie's brother and Caril's brother-in-law also managed to get a police officer to go out there. He went with them. You know, that officer went with them. Gets the same thing from, you know, Caril, sees the note and all sort of thing. And the 2 guys are like, "Look at that note," and you know, the guy's like, the police officer's like, "Oh, you're crazy." Leaves. Then the brother and brother-in-law actually broke into the house. Went and ended up in the backyard and saw the shack and found the bodies back in the shack, and actually the 2-year-old baby half sister had been thrown down in the outhouse. And they said, "We just found 3." They called the police and said, "We just found 3 bodies. Now will you come out here?" And then the police go out there, and that's what they find. They were, you know, investigating that. And by that time, Charlie and Caril were gone. He got spooked when the police officer had come with the grandmother. And that's when they went out and they were driving around, and he was already killing more people along the way, just randomly going around killing some people while they were going to the house to investigate. You know, by the time they finally got there and were investigating it, and while the murder spree was going on, Charlie actually drove right by the police several times, and they just didn't pick up on it, didn't recognize them. Caril, at one point, she threw some books. One of the victims was a teenage girl. Caril got her books, threw them out the window to show the police where they were going. The police found the books and took it to mean they went literally the exact opposite direction. You know, it's an exercise in utter stupidity. And the police knew. I mean, really what happened is that the county attorney, Elmer Scheel, knew that the police had screwed up, but rather than admitting that, and there was actually a federal investigation on the Lincoln Police Department, or in the Nebraska Police Department, Sheriff's Department as well, to find out, well, why'd you guys miss this, and why'd you miss the first murder that happened a month ago? And rather than just admitting, yeah, we screwed up, we weren't prepared for this size of a thing, you know, that sort of thing, instead they used the 14-year-old girl as the scapegoat, and, you know, to kind of shut her up from saying, hey, I left these clues. They were just like, oh, she was his accomplice, kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to shut down another argument, one of the things that I was curious about is, you know, in the things that you've read and the things that you've come across in your research. Now, if I understand this correctly, you know, when they were in the house for those days, in Carol's house, she was under the impression that her family had basically been kidnapped by accomplices of Charlie's.
Right.
And obviously Charlie had cleaned up the mess that he had made. Is there any kind of, I don't know, documentation as to how well he cleaned up? And the only reason I asked this is because Charlie, he didn't seem like the brightest person. And so his cleanup, I always wondered how good it could have been for him to actually fool her in that whole situation.
And that is a very good question, because that's one thing that always, and I was never able to figure out myself and understand, because he clearly apparently had done a very thorough cleanup job, because it wasn't just her who didn't say anything. One of the parts that I'm skipping over, and again, I apologize for jumping so much with the story, but there's so many details to this that I'm, and I know we're limited on time, but when I was telling you about the whole thing about the, grandmother brought one of the police officers, and then, he took her back. That was when Charlie and Carol left the house. And then when the brother and the stepbrother, the brother and the brother-in-law brought a police officer over, that officer actually didn't just directly leave with them. He actually did climb in a window and walked around and then walked back out the front door. And he said, didn't find anything. Well, that officer, in his report, said that the only thing he saw he described what it looked like, and he saw no blood, no evidence that anything had happened, except the one thing that he had seen that was odd was there was a barrel, there was a barrel of a shotgun. So apparently there had been a shotgun that had been sawed off and was placed on top of the television. Now, he didn't find that suspicious for some reason, which is odd, but he himself said, well, there's no blood, never saw anything. Later on, his boss tried to cover up for him by changing the report and saying there was blood everywhere. But then my grandfather immediately jumped on that and went, wait a minute, if there was blood everywhere, why didn't you do anything? You look even more incompetent now. And that's when they went, well, yeah, I had altered the the report or whatever. So how Charlie got it all cleaned up, I have no idea, because he did shoot the mother and stepfather in the house, and then he stabbed the 2-year-old little girl inside the house too, and he killed her there. So how he got it so well cleaned up is sort of odd to me, but but apparently factually that's the case. The police reports themselves say they never found any blood sitting around inside the house. So he apparently did a good job of that one thing. I don't know why or how, but anyway.
Yeah, and then also he didn't exactly have the bodies far away. That was the other thing too. They were basically in the backyard, right?
Right. And, there was a chicken coop actually. So it was far enough that the smell, it was intentionally far away enough that smells would not carry too well in the house, because it's a chicken coop, and so you don't want that to be wafting to the house too much. But yeah, so they were far away for that, so he couldn't see. Some people have said though that it was impossible for him to have carried them out there on his own, and that is absolute nonsense, because he was a strong guy. He was actually a garbage man, and in those days, being a garbage man meant more strength than today, because like today you have the special garbage trucks where it's the entrance to the back is like knee high, but back then they were just pickup trucks, so you had to be able to pick up a huge all those big heavy whatever they were throwing out and throw them over your head into the pickup or whatever it was. So this guy was used to carrying heavy things on his own. He had no problem doing that without Carol's help. Carol wouldn't have been any help. She couldn't even lift the shotgun. This was actually witnesses of some of Charlie's friends later witnessed that Carol, when she would go out hunting with them, she could not even hold the gun up very well. Like, she couldn't hold it up and keep it steady because she was just not strong enough. So this is a very, very weak girl.
Yeah, and Charlie was a small guy too. How
right.
small was Carol? If you had your guesses, I don't know if you have the actual statistics, but if Charlie's a small guy and she's smaller than him, how small was she?
Yeah, I have it in the book somewhere. I think I have it in the book. She's something like 4 or 5 or something like that. She was not just 14. She was short for a 14-year-old. She was very close to being what you refer to as a small person. Yeah. To this day, she's really tiny.
Yeah, I was going to say, the only time they said she looked older was because, some of her facial features looked a little older, but, I guess we can get into this, but, your grandfather had to get into a situation where he had to try the case for the media. And I don't mean that literally, but, you know,
Right.
the prosecution forced that on them. So I guess we'll go ahead and start with the kind of the tricks that the prosecution used to kind of try the case in the media and how your grandfather responded.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you bring that up, because that to me is a very important part of the story. So yeah, I mean, before it was even done, the police are utilizing, actually, particularly the county attorney Elmer Scheel, you know, because they go to them asking questions. Again, this is the 1950s. The word of the police is the word of God. So whatever they're saying, you know, they're just saying, well, this is what happened, that sort of thing. So they're essentially telling the papers and all that that she was, you know, accomplice, and here's what happened, et cetera, et cetera. And they were actually closing her off from being able to talk to the media. When if you see any of the photos from that time, when you know, big headlines say Caril Fugate captured and shows her in a car, you'll notice the windows are always closed. Part of that reason was they didn't want anybody revealing to her that she was being charged with accessory to murder. In fact, there are some of those where she's smiling and people are like, oh, look at that murderess. She's smiling, how evil of her. But when you look from her point of view, she thinks she's been rescued and has no idea she's being charged. You know, she's just coming back being like, oh, thank God, this nightmare is over. And so, but, you know, and they wouldn't let her see any newspapers or any of the headlines. So they're basically portraying her as this monster who came back smiling from this murder spree, et cetera, et cetera. My grandfather, he was very adamantly opposed to trying anything through the media. I mean, at that time, that wasn't really even a very well-known tactic. Like today, lawyers do that all the time, but he was very wary of that whole concept. To him, it should all be factual. It should all be in the courtroom, you know, put it all there. But so much was happening. In fact, there was a rumor starting to go around that Caril was pregnant with Charlie's with Charlie's baby. And so there were some reporters who were wanting to get a story, you know, wanting to get an interview with Caril, and my grandfather was so adamantly opposed to that. But finally, he relented to the television news reporter. And at that time, this is early television. You did not have anything. In fact, none of these types of murders or anything like that had been shown. Had really been, the suspects hadn't really been interviewed on TV shows. Again, or on television news channels. Again, this is one of those things where we take it for granted now that it's the television is God, and the newspapers are hardly paid attention to. But at that time, it was exactly the opposite. Everybody believed what the newspaper said, and television, well, that's intended for entertainment. You know, that's where you watch your comedies and that sort of thing. But this early TV or local TV station really wanted to have an interview with her, and it was a woman named Ninette Beaver who was really pushing for an interview for her boss Floyd Calber to have an interview with her. And Floyd Calber actually eventually went on to work for the Today Show. But Ninette Beaver was really working on my grandfather, trying to get him to do an interview. He kept saying no. Finally, my grandfather relented, but he said, I want you to be the one who interviews her. So in the 1950s, when typically women were being, overlooked for everything, and Ninette Beaver herself was typically more treated like almost more like a secretary than anything, my grandfather believed, no, she will be the right one to, interview her, even though this was the interview of the decade. This was the thing that reporters all over the country wanted, national, well-known anchors, that sort of thing. They could have had anybody they wanted, but he's like, no, you're the one who has pushed for this, who said this is important. You're the one who pointed out the fact that the other side is saying, is spreading rumors that she's pregnant. So you're going to be there. So what they did was they had a press conference, and all of these news stations from across the country could be there, but only Ninette Beaver would then be able to ask her questions. And so they did, and there was, like I said, there's this interview which actually you can even see online. I've posted it online, and I think you can see it some other places as well, where Ninette Beaver asks all these questions of Caril. And I think what you were starting to allude to as well, if I may just go into the way that Caril reacted, the kind of cold attitude that she had. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it kind of backfired, because the idea was to show everybody, Caril's face and say, okay, this is her story, this is what happened. Unfortunately, though, before it happened, my grandfather told her, don't get too emotional. And what my grandfather was worried about was that she would, as this 14-year-old little girl, would get really emotional. And my grandfather had seen her being very animated and very upset about things. And so he was like, you know what, just make sure to, keep it in. Don't, they might misread it and stuff. Well, Caril had learned from her mother her mother had always said, it had always been very